Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a little bit difficult to sit here and be lectured on science and R&D funding by the National Party.
That's right.
This is a party who, when they first came into government, cut the programs that Labor had put in place and sent us, in one swift sign of the pen, down to the bottom of the OECD when it came to investment in R&D. In one move, New Zealand went straight to the bottom of the OECD. And I note that with their much lauded new grants for business, that Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, who said yes, they will be getting a couple of $1 million out of this, that's half as much as they would have got out of Labor's R&D tax credits. And Mr. Speaker, you know the other important thing about Labor's R&D tax credits is that small businesses were eligible. Small businesses. Because under the National Party's program, small business misses out. And in fact, small business get a paltry few crumbs in that R&D package, despite the fact that they are some of our most innovative companies, despite the fact that they are the very ones who cannot afford to invest in R&D and need that extra assistance. The national government have said no. In fact, we're going to cut small business out of this entirely, and they are not going to be eligible for any of these R&D benefits. They also go on about their primary growth partnership, which is this ghost of a policy because no money has ever been allocated out of it. $700 million was sitting in a bank account for Labor's Fast Forward Fund to fund agriculture and horticultural science, sitting there ready to go, and the National Party transferred it back into the Consolidated Fund, said sorry to the science community, and we're going to put in place a fund that so far as we're aware, doesn't even exist. So I say to the National Party, they may want to be very careful, because even though they've renamed a few of Labor's policies as their own, even though, I think, what is it? Reprioritisation is the new catchword. After they got caught out calling a cut a change, they're now calling a cut a reprioritisation. They've brought back in some of the policies they cut out of last year's budget and are now trying to claim it's this great, new, brilliant idea. But and a theme about broken promises in this budget, and this is a budget of broken promises. Where is the money they promised the Crown Research Institutes? $350 million they promised them last year, this year. Where is it? Oh, they've all gone quiet now. They've all gone quiet now because there was another broken promise in this year's budget. And I want to come to Jonathan Coleman, and say to that member, the only way that Ian Lees-Galloway would lose his seat of Palmerston North is if Jonathan Coleman came and was his campaign manager. That is the only way he would lose that seat of Palmerston North. Jonathan Coleman, who spent 8 minutes personally attacking every single member on this side of the House, and then when one person interjected something to do with policy, he said, don't get personal. The Honourable Jonathan Coleman said that Labor was bullying elderly people because we've been sticking up for them when the national government has been cutting their home help. He said we were bullying them. And then that says something, or bullying and scaring them. Bullying and scaring. So those people down in Southland who've had their home care cut, we've been bullying them by raising that in the House and holding the Minister to account. That says a lot for the national government. The advocacy equals bullying in their view. And I say to Jonathan Coleman, we're not going to stop raising issues of cuts in frontline services, another broken budget promise. Another broken, twist the truth, says Melissa Lee. Well, I challenge her to go down to Southland and tell those elderly people who've had their home care cut that they're twisting the truth. We don't need to scare the public, Miss Lee. We don't need to scare the public because they know that the cuts are there. They're feeling them when they get a phone call from the DHB, which they don't realise is an assessment, and then get told that their home help is being cut. Now, $30 a week isn't a lot to members on the opposite side of the House. It's not a lot to them. But it is to those elderly people when they get that home help for 1.5, maybe 2 hours a week. And Labor will defend those public services that the national government seems so intent on cutting. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about housing in this budget. And members might say, why would you talk about housing in this budget? Because there was no housing in this budget, and that's true. And after this year's budget, there'll be even less housing in New Zealand, particularly New Zealand housing. Now, I want to take members back to after the election and the glorious spectacle that was the Minister of Housing, Phil Heatley. Now, he's quite a flamboyant minister. He'd get up, he'd wave his arm around, he'd dance. His colleagues would all cheer and clap as he'd go on about how much more state housing National was going to build, how much they cared about state house tenants. They cared more about state house tenants than Labor members did, how he was the man for state house tenants. He was going to fix everything. Well, he sat there like a broken man during this budget, slinking further and further down into his seat, because Phil Heatley knew that this was a bad budget for housing. More than 80% of the housing budget from last year was cut from this year's budget. Worse than that, the minister went on radio this week and said, well, if Housing New Zealand want to build more state houses, and remember there's nearly 11,000 families waiting on Housing New Zealand waiting lists around the country, well, they're going to have to fund it out of existing baselines. They're going to have to make savings elsewhere within their organisation. So basically the word to Housing New Zealand staff is bring a pen from home, because the stationary budget's cut and we need to build a few more houses. And what makes it so offensive is that this is the minister who sat idly by while Housing New Zealand have paid consultants $600 an hour developing a business case, just a business case, that cost $11 million. And what was that business case for? For a computer upgrade that a consultancy report that Housing New Zealand themselves commissioned told them they didn't need. Housing New Zealand's own report said to them the existing system is fit for purpose. It was developed so that it could be continually upgraded as things change. You can make upgrades to the existing Rentel system. The Finance One system was actually upgraded a couple of years ago, so I don't know why they're doing that again. But the fact is they're about to spend $50 million if we believe that that's all it's going to cost. If we believe that's all it's going to cost, because of course they first said the business case cost $6 million, then we discovered it's $11 million. Some inside information has told us it's actually more than $20 million. Well, how does that sit alongside a budget that's cut money for housing when that housing minister refused to do anything about that? Refused to step in and say this is a waste of public money, refused to even ask any questions about it. You know what he said? It's a matter for the Housing New Zealand Board. Well, why do we even have a housing minister if the Housing New Zealand Board are able to throw money away like that should be being spent on our most vulnerable families? Should be spent on building and upgrading and maintaining state houses. We did a good job in our 9 years in government. We were in a deficit of 14,000 state houses that the previous national government sold. We had to build more houses during one of the biggest housing booms we've ever had in this country. It wasn't easy, but we stuck to our promise and we did what we could in that respect. But now we see that there are these huge cuts. So then we say to the minister, well, have you had any advice on the impact of increases in GST, increases in inflation, and on increases in rents coming out of this budget on demand for state housing? So have you even bothered to ask whether the demand for state housing is going to get worse? No, he didn't even bother to ask that. Not even concerned about what it means for those most vulnerable families. Because, Mr Speaker, Infometrics have said rents will go up by up to 8%. Property investors predict up to 6.5%, and that's the landlord group, the property investors. And when you consider that 30% of New Zealand households rent, and of that 30%, a full 50% have a combined household income of under $50,000. That's household income of $50,000. These are the people who are getting nothing out of this year's budget. What paltry gains they make in tax cuts, they are going to lose in GST, they are going to lose in inflation, and they are going to lose in rent increases doubly over. These are the people who are going to be the most impacted. And I briefly want to talk about affordable housing, Mr Speaker, because we've been promised the National Party's grand gateway housing scheme for 2 budgets now. 2 budgets, and where is it? Nothing again for affordable housing. Nothing to address the housing pressures, particularly in Auckland. In Manurewa, where my colleague George Hawkins comes from, there is 1 house being built for every 14 households that are moving to that area. And there was nothing in here. In fact, throwing more GST on the cost of building a house is not going to help alleviate housing pressures in Auckland. And this housing minister has no plan for affordable housing. He has no plan for dealing with homelessness around the country and in Auckland. Absolutely nothing about that, and the fact that we could see more families moving into that very sad situation as a result of this budget, and the Minister of Housing had nothing to say about that. In fact, his press release, Mr Speaker, was basically just lauding the fact that he didn't lose the Housing Innovation Fund, that he didn't lose that particular fund, and then he went on to talk about 3 policies, 2 of which were Labor Party policies, that he adopted when he became minister, and congratulations, and we're happy he did that, and one about letting State House tenants buy their own homes, of which in 1 year only 17 people have been able to do that, which is why we said it was a cruel hoax. And of course less are going to be able to do that now with the increases in GST, increases in inflation, increases in rent. This is an incredibly bad budget for housing.